Good afternoon. I'm Millie Blackwell from Showcase, and I'm so happy to be here today introducing my friend Brigitte Lyons, who is the founder of Podcast Ally. As well as being a podcast about podcasting, Podcast Ally is a boutique communications agency helping thought leaders land podcast interviews on popular shows like Mixergy, What Works, and Being Boss. I know Brigitte always packs her presentations with a ton of value, so I promise you're going to be so happy that you tuned in today. And I do just want to add that Brigitte doesn't just know podcasting. She brings her vast knowledge of traditional PR to her clients at Podcast Ally, of which I have been one. So I can say with authority that what you're going to see today is just the tip of the iceberg of quite how talented this lady is. So with that, Brigitte.
Oh, thank you so much, Millie. It's always a treat to hear how different people will introduce your work, and I love that one. I am really excited to be here talking about this topic on how to be the perfect podcast guest, because this is something that we think about a lot from multiple sides at my agency. Not only do we pitch podcasts for our clients, and that's what we do as our primary scope of work, but I also host a podcast and have been on a lot of podcasts. So we'll be talking through things from all of these different perspectives. And I just want to start out by thanking you so much for attending this presentation, whether you're live with me or watching the recording later. I know that there's a lot competing for your attention. And like Millie said, I promise you, I have packed this presentation full of useful information that you can start incorporating right away if you're doing any kind of podcast interviews to really be a great guest and ultimately get more out of them. So you know you're in the right place with us today if you get really fired up when someone shows a genuine interest in your work. If you're the kind of person who just loves to talk about what you do, about how you do it, and the methodology, this is for you. Also, if your best clients and customers buy into not just what you sell, but also the mission that you bring to your work or the passion or the value sets. And then finally, you're in the right place today if networking and making connections has led to more work and opportunities for you in the past. Because all of these things mean that podcasts are an ideal marketing venue for you. And you have a lot of opportunity with promoting your work through podcasts. But could you be getting more out of the interviews that you're giving? So I popped in the chat. I'd love it if you could just let me know if you've actually been on a podcast, if you've done an interview before, or if you're prepping for your first one. I always love to know that context. And I'd also love to know just where you're attending from today, because I like to travel around and it's a real treat to see where people are from. So the answer to that question, could you be getting more from the podcast interviews you're giving, is yes, if you don't go into every interview you're doing with a very clear idea of what kind of insight and ahas you give the audience, and more importantly, or just as importantly, I should say, how you're actually going to invite them back to your website and into your work at the end of that podcast interview. So if you don't actually have an idea of that before you start an interview, you have a lot of opportunity to improve your guesting skills. Also, there's a lot of opportunity for you if you really leave it up to the podcast host to do background research on you and your topic. And this goes whether you are submitting yourself to be a guest on podcasts or if the host has reached out to you. So if you're leaving it up to them to figure out how to introduce you, your work, what kind of questions they should be asking, what topics to bring up, there's a lot more you could be doing to making these podcast interviews a better experience for you, the host, and the audience. And then finally, if you're not seeing results, so for a lot of people, these are email opt-ins or actual cash money in the bank in the form of sales from the podcast interviews you're giving. Well, wow, hopefully today I can help you turn that around, because those are all outcomes that are not just possible, but they happen every single day for our clients. So today, just in brief, we're going to be covering why it's worth your time to develop these skills, your podcast interview skills, what makes the podcast venue different from other kinds of interviews you might give. So I know a lot of people here are in the content business. You might have done other kinds of media, and there's some things about podcasts that are just a little bit different than other kinds of media that you might be familiar with. And then what the difference is between giving a so-so and a standout podcast interview, and how you can be sure you're a standout every single time and getting those results. We're also going to have a Q&A at the end, so please do save your questions. I know Millie is going to be collecting them so that she can share them back with me. Okay, you might notice in my background, if you travel at all, that I am in a travel trailer, a camper right now. So just really briefly, why the heck would you listen to this crazy lady in a camper? Well, first of all, I have a big agency background. So I came up in the PR world working at one of the biggest global PR agencies in the world. I've worked with a lot of mainstream media, including CNN, Bloomberg, the Chicago Tribune, which is where I'm from, tons of mainstream outlets. But on top of that, my agency specializes and has been specializing for the past few years in podcasts. We are responsible for placing more than 200 podcast interviews for our clients. So we have heard and listened to and monitored the results from a lot of interviews. And ultimately, being a great guest is really about getting great results, right? Making a great experience for you and for the audience so that you get the results that you want out of those interviews. And that's really what my company is focused on. It's not just about doing PR for PR's sake, but it's what are you going to get out of every single interview that you are given. Super fast. This is one of my favorite case studies to share. This is my client, Jenny Nash. And she is a book coach. She helps people write their books, whether it's business, nonfiction, memoir. And she has a startup that does book coaching. And when we did podcast interviews with her, she actually brought in $50,000 of revenue for her company directly from her just 9 podcast interviews that she had given. Now, there's a turnaround story here that I'm going to tell you later. She did not get these results right off the bat. She actually had to implement some of the things that we're going to talk about before she went from getting no results from her interviews to getting this $50,000 in revenue. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. So like I said, today we focus almost exclusively on podcast bookings. And we do that basically because the podcast audience is really, really special. And we see some things happening in podcasts that we don't see happening in other kinds of media. So just to set aside the fact that I'm a total podcast junkie, I'm going to share some stats with you about the podcast listener, and these all apply to me. What's really important to know is that podcast listeners are reliable buyers. People who listen to podcasts are really moved to take action. And so when you give an interview with them, it's important to know what kind of action you want them to take. So this audience is very, very large. There are 62 million people who listen to podcasts every single week. And those people tend to listen to a lot of content. The average podcast listener listens to 7 podcasts every single week. So they are super fans of this content. They also tend to listen from start to finish. And this is something that is really special about podcasts. So 93% of people who tune into a podcast interview actually listen to the whole thing. So they start an episode and they go all the way to the end. You can see that even like 41% are listening to most, so more than half of the podcast. So this gives you a lot of space in your interview to develop a relationship, to develop trust with that listener. And that's a big part of what makes this such a big opportunity. The other piece of this that I think is really important to know is that the average length of a podcast episode is 41 minutes. So you have a lot of space to develop your ideas, to share common ground, to share your values, to share stories with that audience and really make a connection with them. And that's really where the results come from, because podcast fans are unusually engaged in the content they take in. I mean, when you think about the other kinds of content that you might get, whether it's through Facebook, right? You might see a Fast Company article pop up on your Facebook feed or something from Vox or CNN. Maybe you engage with that content for a few minutes. Or even like if you're like me, you really like YouTube, right? But a YouTube video is maybe 15 minutes long. There's not a lot of other formats where people are actually tuning in for 40 minutes up to an hour, start to finish, to listen to an interview. It's really, really rare. And that's why we tended to see that podcasts for all of our clients outperformed other kinds of earned media. This is another client of ours, Rita Berry. She does Facebook ads. I thought this would be a good one for our content folk today. Rita is a very specialized high-end service. They do not take on a lot of clients. And we did a podcast outreach program for her. And she added 3 clients, filled up all of her work, and then had 4 people go on the wait list. She also had this experience where people checked out the podcast on her media page before hiring her. So they were thinking about hiring Rita. They went to the media page to hear a podcast. liked what they heard, and then decided to hire her over another agency. And that's really emblematic of what happens with podcasts, because you get this amazing opportunity to make a connection. But of course, this is all going back to the results you get, what kind of guest you are, and how you show up for every interview. So that's really the power of the podcast audience. And like I said, why we are so bullish on podcasts. Now, getting to what's under your control, it turns out that there is a lot of control that you have as a guest with how every single interview you're going to be goes. You can really, really influence the direction and the content of the podcast interviews that you give, no matter what kind of context the interview has to start out with. And that's because of the way the podcast format tends to work. So there are some podcasts that will come and say, I have like 10 questions that we ask every single time, but most of them are more open-ended. So if you think back to the last podcast interview you heard, think about that for a second. How did it start? You might have been asked, well, tell me how you got started, or take me back to the beginning of your work, or tell me about what you do. Right off the very beginning of every podcast interview, you have the opportunity to set the tone, to start telling the stories, and to control exactly what kind of messages you're going to get out for that interview. And this is an area where when people don't do a lot of prep, they tend to kind of waste this opportunity. So it takes some time to warm up into, oh God, what am I going to say in the beginning? They might ramble. They might not have a clear idea of what they want to get across. Or they might talk so long and forget that they're having this really intimate human-to-human conversation with a host and not give the host any space. That's also kind of a problem when you don't have a lot of prep. And this is why, for me, it's like being the perfect podcast guest is all about the preparation. It's all about what you bring to every single interview. So I think it's really important that you always begin with the end in mind, because I've been talking about, how you can get these amazing results from your podcast guesting. So you want to think to yourself before you give an interview, whether you pitched it or whether you've been invited, what action do I most want the listener to take after the interview? You can think about, you might want them to hire you, right? That is a great call to action, is actually to ask for the sale. Maybe you want to inspire the listener to adopt a new habit or creative practice. Or maybe you just want to spread a message or idea and get more mainstream acceptance. Those are all kind of actions that you can have that listener help you with. And so based on that, you want to think about, okay, if I'm going to have them do this action, what kind of information do they need? Well, most people need inspiring stories, right? We are storytelling animals. We really respond to stories. So you want to make sure that you have some stories that inspire them and influence this action. You also want to make sure that they walk away with a key insight or an aha moment from the interview that they will really remember and that's sticky for them. And then lastly, it can be really great to convey a shared sense of values with the guest, because you do have all of this space, and it's a great way to bring forth a little bit more than just the topic at hand and let them get to know you a little bit more and what drives you. So clarity around the goals really leads to clarity in the interviews, and that's what leads to having a great interview every time. For example, if you want to sell service, your interview can lead up to a solid call to action that says, hey, if you really liked what I had to say today, you can come over to my website and sign up for a free consultation. So at the end, when the host says, where can I find you? You don't have to give them your Instagram handle. You can literally ask for the sale. And then if throughout the interview, you've been sharing customer success stories, talking about your values as a company, and any other kind of talking points and messages that will help you close the deal, what you're going to see is that there's going to be a segment of people that really want to come over and take that next step for you. So you want it all to lead up to that end result or goal or action that you have for the audience. So I have this really simple method that I started instituting for myself and that I like to teach now, and it's the 3-1-1 sticky note method. So we want to prepare, but we don't want to overburden ourselves, right? We don't want to be like doing so much prep work that we get lost in the interview. We have too many messages. We want to keep it simple. So that's what this 3-1-1 sticky note method is. What I like to do is literally on a sticky note, jot down what are 3 key messages that I want to have come across. So what are the 3 things that I really want to convey throughout this 40-minute interview? For each of those three messages, I'll pull out what is one supporting story. So what's an actual example that I can give that supports each of those three key messages? And what is my one call to action going to be at the end of the interview? So when the host says, so tell me where people can connect with you, I don't just blank out and freeze and lose that opportunity. So to give you an example using this exact presentation I'm giving, so a key message that I would jot down if this were a podcast interview would be, the difference between giving a so-so and a standout podcast interview is in the preparation, because that's something I want you to remember. I want you to remember not just to show up and wing it, but I want you to take action by preparing for your actual podcast interviews. A supporting story. So I told you we come back to my client, Jenny Nash. So Jenny Nash, when we started working with her, was having a bit of an identity shift. She'd gone from a person who was working one-on-one with clients and coaching them directly to a person who had coaches she had trained, and she wanted to be really selling people into that startup she had called Author Accelerator. When we listened and analyzed Jenny's initial podcast interviews, what we found is that she was getting a lot of inquiries from people who said, Jenny, I want to hire you to be my book coach. And she's like, I don't want to work with people one-on-one. I want them to come into my coaching company. So we listened to those interviews, and what we found was that whenever Jenny told a story, whenever people asked her, like a podcaster said, okay, so tell us how book coaching goes, she would tell a story about her experiences coaching people. And what we had her make the shift to do was tell a story about her Author Accelerator coaches and what kind of success they could have with that. And so it was really, really important for us to work with that messaging for her so that her message that she was sharing, her stories that she was sharing in her interviews actually led to the real goal that she had, which was not for more personal clients, but for clients for her startup. And that's when we had that complete turnaround and people started actually hiring her company. And then the call to action you might prepare for a podcast would be something like a resource. So here, it's actually in the handouts, but I wanted to give you an example of this look like. So in a podcast, the host might say, okay, where can we get more information? And I might say, hey, if you've really enjoyed this talk, you could go to podcastally.com/prep and get our full interview checklist. It's an amazing resource for you. So that all leads together, right? Because this checklist is supported by those messages that I had in a call to action. You can go to that page and check it out, but you can also download it in the handout notes here. Okay, so those are kind of the steps that you can take to prepare yourself. But before we wrap up, we're almost at the end of this, where we'll get to the Q&A. I want to mention that it's not only about your message. You don't want to show up and be that person who is so polished and you're only caring about the things that you want to get across, right? Where you're so polished, you won't even answer a direct question from the host. We've all heard politicians do that, right? You don't want to come across like that. So you also want to do a little prep in looking into the host. So who are they? What do they care about? Have they written a book? And what questions do they tend to ask so that you're really ready for them? So what we always do to prepare our clients is we listen to the very first 15 minutes and the last 15 minutes of 2 or 3 episodes, just to see if there's questions that the podcasters ask at the beginning and end of every interview. And then you'll get a sense, do they always start their interviews by asking you, so tell me about your work. Tell me how you got into this. If you know that the last 3 interviews started that way, you can prepare yourself to be able to answer that question right off the bat. Another thing is that if a host has a really common question and you're not prepared for it, it's actually a way to lose a little bit of trust that you're gaining with that audience. So this is an example of Being Boss. I was on their podcast. They're actually also a former client of mine. I worked on their book tour, and Being Boss always asks you at the end of the episode, what makes you feel most boss? If you show up for that interview and you're not ready to answer that question, it's just a little unconscious thing for the listener where they realize you're not a fan of the show they're a fan of. And remember, podcast listeners are super fans. They want to know that you share this common fandom with them. And so it's really important that you listen to the beginning and the end of the episode so that you know that's coming and you can be ready to answer that question. You can also be sure that you prep the host with the materials they need to give you a really amazing interview. So every podcast host out there wants to facilitate a really insightful and entertaining interview, right? They want to give their fans great content, but they are not the experts on you. Even if they invite you in, they're not the experts on your story, your message, what you're doing right there. And you can really go above and beyond by helping that podcast host make it a great interview. So you can prepare them really simply by giving them a link to a media kit. So we've been using Notion, but we also use Google Docs for this, where you just literally put together your images, a bio, and some background information on you that the host can find all at one link to help prepare themselves for doing the interview. Within that, it can be really great to actually include some blog posts or even social media updates on the topics that you might want to talk about. So this is another client of ours, Lacey Boggs, where she had some kind of key content pieces. And so we put those together for podcast hosts to find, because she blogs, she's a ghost blogger, she's a content marketing strategist. So she has a ton of blog posts, right? We create a list for the podcast that were related to the topics and the messages that she wanted to get out. So that's something that you can add to your media kit, just a few background pieces of content that the podcaster might want to look at to give you a great interview. And then the last thing, which is like a super extra bonus thing to do, is read your bio aloud. So most podcasters will introduce you using the bio that you send them, but our bios are often meant to be read. And when you read them aloud, they're either too long or they're like really run-on sentences. They're kind of awkward. So actually read it and make sure that the host can use it exactly as it is in an introduction. And that when they're reading it to introduce you, it's going to sound great. It's just like one of those like little extra chef's kiss kind of moments where you can make the tone really great from the very start. So before you go onto a podcast, you really want to ask yourself, what does this host need to know to make this a great interview for me, for the host, as well as for the listener, and put those materials together, give them a link where they can grab everything they need. So, as what it is to be the perfect podcast guest is really the perfect podcast guest. You're prepared, and you also help make the host, make sure that they're prepared. And that's when you're going to start getting this amazing feedback and amazing results from the podcast interviews you're giving. Ideally, all this prep that you're doing really will free you up to be in the moment during the conversation, because you feel confident, you feel prepared, you're not caught off guard by the kinds of questions you're getting, but you know what you want to have come across. And ideally, you have just the right amount of prep where you can be in the moment, where you can tell stories really naturally, but you don't want to go so far that you feel over-rehearsed. And so that's why I like that 3-1-1 sticky note method, because it's really simple. I have literally just put my sticky note on my computer monitor in front of me just to remind me of the things that I really wanted to have come across in an interview. And remember, most of all, that podcasts are really about a human-to-human connection, right? You are actually having a one-on-one, human-to-human conversation with that host, and all of those fans are getting to eavesdrop. And so being in the moment with the host, being able to tell amazing stories and get that point across, that is something that will really connect with the audience. And it's that intimacy of that conversation that really makes podcasts so compelling and so interesting, and why those of us who listen to 7 podcast episodes a week keep tuning in episode after episode. All right. Well, I think that is it. I think I've somehow managed to come in pretty close to time. So I am happy to take any questions. I know Millie's kind of popping back.
Have any questions, there's a Q&A. You're probably used to it by now after so many sessions today, but pop a question in the Q&A panel at the side of the screen there, and I will ask it to Brigitte. I don't think it comes through publicly, but while we wait for questions, Brigitte, you did mention this, but you advocate for literally taking your 3-1-1 stickies and putting them on your computer while you're doing the call, right?
Yes. It really helps me, because what I'm saying with each of these is like the messages, hopefully it's your expertise, right? So you only need a couple of words or a phrase. And then like in my demo too, I had said Jenny Nash story. Like, I know Jenny's story. I tell it a little differently every time, but you don't have to have a whole document written out on your computer. So the sticky right in front of you is like, just remember, this is what I want to get out of this interview. It's really all you need.
And I thought it was really interesting when you're talking about how obvious it can be when somebody hasn't listened to some episodes and doesn't know the common parts of the format. A podcast I listen to is called Erasable, and it's all about stationery. And they have a section in there called Tools of the Trade, where you talk about what you're writing with and what you're writing on, and they talk about what they're listening to and watching. And it's really obvious when a guest hasn't prepared for that. But the other thing that you might have a comment on is it's also really obvious when the guest has over-prepared or when they've tried to be too clever about their answer. So do you have any advice on avoiding over-preparing or over-rehearsing?
Yeah, this is actually in that guide a little. It's alluded in that handout that you can all download. But one of the things you want to make sure is when the host asks you a question, like, answer the question. That's one of the things that when people are really well media trained, they can tend to spin any question to go into the answer they want to give. And so it's really important to, I said, like, be in the moment, to listen to what the podcast host is answering and give it to you. In PR, in media training, there's this whole technique called block and bridging. So that's what's in the handout, where you can answer a question and then bridge it to what you actually want to be talking about, but you don't want to just skip that first part. And so that to me is a dead giveaway when you have a guest, they come in with such a clear agenda that, like, you'll hear this on interviews. They'll get a direct question and they just act like, whoop, I'm going to take it in this completely different direction. And that's a turn off for people to hear, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a shy group today who haven't given us any questions. So,
so sad.
So I guess we probably says in your handout, but maybe you can take the chance to tell this shy audience where they can find out some more about you.
Yeah, so you can go to that website, podcastally.com. And if you go to the one, it has like the podcastally.com/prep. That has the handout, and you'll enter our email list and get some information from us about what we do. Most of our work is actually managing all of the podcast bookings for our clients, but we do a lot of education as well, because one of the things I'm a big evangelist on is, like, so many of us here are in the content business, that people can do it themselves and they can also choose to hire out. It's a really personal decision. And I'm a big believer that there's not one that is necessarily better than the other. It's like, which one is the best for you? And so whether you want to learn and have these skills and do them themselves, or if you want to get somebody to help you, like, I just want you to get out there. I just want the voices to be heard on the podcast for more stories, more messages, more ideas to get out there. And so I do hope, whether you've done an interview before or you haven't, maybe I've convinced you that this is a worthwhile thing for you to try out for yourself, and in whatever way that makes the most sense for you.
And just in our last minute, where can people go if they want to find out more about your life in the trailer?
That would probably be the best on my Instagram. So I am Brigitte Lyons on Instagram, and I share photos and updates in my stories. And yeah, I would have the window open behind me, but the sun is open there. I am right now just sitting in a beautiful national forest outside of Flagstaff on my way to the Grand Canyon. My husband and I travel around and kind of share our adventures. We've been doing this about 2 months now.
There's a couple of notes in our chat, sorry to put you on the spot, about your life in the trailer. So Robin said that she's taken away some great tips to share with her guests as she hosts a podcast. And
Great.
Leslie joined us late, but is very much looking forward to the recording, which I'm sure there'll be several people doing.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I know I saw people filtering in, which I love to see. And if you do have any questions, if you sign up for that email list, the emails come from me directly. So you can always respond to any promo email and I will respond back to you. So I'm always happy to help in that way too.
All right. Well, thanks, Brigitte. It was a great session. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.